The wind in the shadow fen was a blade honed on bone. It sliced through Ilara's thin cloak, a familiar, biting cruelty that promised a winter of starvation. Here, on the blighted border between her mother's domain and the lands of the Winter King, everything was sharp and dying. The trees were skeletal fingers scratching at a bruised purple sky. The very air tasted of rot and old sorrows. She should have been back in the village, huddled by the meager warmth of the communal fire, enduring the whispers and the sideways glances. She was the matriarch's daughter, a truth that offered no comfort, only a more refined form of misery. Morwen, her mother, ruled the fen with a fist of shadow and spite, and Ilara, her lightless, powerless child, was her greatest shame, a constant walking reminder of a failed bloodline. So she came here, to the forbidden edge of the woods, where the bittercress grew in stubborn frost-kissed patches. Its root, when boiled, could stave off the lung rot that always came with the deep cold. It was a small rebellion, a secret act of preservation in a land that celebrated decay. A flicker of movement in the snow-choked gully below caught her eye, not the gray flash of a winter fox or the lumbering shape of a starved bear. This was something vast and black, a patch of living midnight against the stark white of the landscape. It paced, a frantic, caged energy in its movement, circling something on the ground. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Her mother's patrols were merciless. To be found here was to be whipped, or worse. But this was no patrol. This was something else, something ancient and wild. Curiosity, a dangerous and foolish impulse she had never managed to beat out of herself, pulled her forward. She crept along the ridge of the gully, her worn leather boots making no sound in the fresh powder. As she drew closer, the shape resolved itself. A wolf. But that word was too small, too tame. This creature was a beast from a forgotten age, its shoulders as broad as a draft horse, its fur the color of a starless night. Its eyes were burning coals, embers of a dying fire, and they glowed with a feral intelligence that was terrifyingly sentient, and it was guarding the still form of a man lying half-buried in the snow. Ilara's breath hitched. She knew the legends. Every child in the Shadowfen was raised on tales of the Winterfang King and his inseparable shadow, the great beast that was the living embodiment of his power. A creature that was not merely a wolf, but a second soul, a phantom of fury and loyalty. Which meant the man on the ground. She slid down the snowy embankment, her feet sinking deep, the cold instantly seeping into her boots. The beast's head snapped up. A growl rumbled from its chest, a sound like grinding glaciers, deep and full of menace. It bared teeth like ivory daggers. She froze. This was it. This was how she died. Not from starvation or her mother's ire, but torn apart by a legend in the woods. But she didn't run. She looked past the terrifying phantom, at the man. He was huge, a giant clad in dark, travel-stained leathers. His face, partially obscured by snow and strands of black hair, was all harsh angles and unforgiving lines, even in unconsciousness. King Kaelin, the Alpha King of Winterfang, her mother's most hated enemy. He was supposed to be a god of winter, an invincible force of nature. He looked like he was dying. A strange thing happened then. The beast's growl subsided. It watched her, its ember eyes narrowed, not with aggression, but with an unnerving, desperate scrutiny. It was as if it were asking her something, pleading with her. A low whine escaped its throat, a sound of profound grief. Slowly, cautiously, Ilara took another step. The beast didn't move. It simply watched, its head lowered, a plume of steam jetting from its nostrils. She knelt beside the king. A deathly cold radiated from him, a chill so profound it was a physical presence. It was wrong, unnatural. This wasn't the simple cold of the snow. This was a cold that came from within, a devouring frost that seemed to be consuming his very life force. His skin, where it was visible, was tinged with blue. There was a spiderweb of frost in his dark hair. Treason. The word screamed in her mind. To help him was to betray her people, her mother, everything she knew. Morin would not just kill her for this. She would make her wish for death for 1,000 years. But to leave him here, to leave anyone to this fate, was a cruelty she couldn't stomach. She had seen enough cruelty to last a lifetime. She looked at the beast. "I won't hurt him," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind. The great wolf seemed to understand. It took a step back, settling onto its haunches, its gaze never leaving her, a silent, grim sentinel. Her choice was made. Treason it was then. She had never belonged anyway. She worked quickly, her hands clumsy with cold and fear. She couldn't move him. Not alone. He was a mountain of a man. Shelter was the only option. Using her gathering knife, she cut away the low-hanging, snow-laden branches of a dense fir tree, creating a small hollow against its trunk. She scraped away the snow, piling it up to form a crude wall against the wind. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Her fingers were numb, aching things, but she forced them to work, pulling dry twigs from the underside of fallen logs and shaving tinder from a piece of birch bark she kept in her pouch. Her flint and steel were her most prized possessions. It took what felt like an eternity, her shivering hands refusing to cooperate. But finally, a tiny spark caught. She nurtured it, shielded it with her own body, whispering to it like a frightened child until it grew into a small, defiant flame. The beast, which she had started to think of as Nyx, a name for the night it so perfectly embodied, watched the fire with wary intelligence. It did not seem to fear it. The hardest part was getting the king into the shelter. She pushed and pulled, her muscles screaming in protest, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He was in dead weight, all unyielding muscle and bone. Finally, she managed to drag him close enough to the fire that its meager warmth might touch him. She dared to brush the snow from his face. His features were even harsher up close, a face carved from granite and fury. A faint scar cut through one dark eyebrow. Even with the pallor of death upon him, he was beautiful. But it was the beauty of a storm, of a glacier, merciless and vast. Parve. She touched his hand. The cold was a shock, a physical blow. It wasn't just cold. It was an absence of heat so absolute it felt like it was stealing the warmth from her own veins. It burned. She pulled her hand back with a gasp, cradling her aching fingers. What had happened to him? What could do this to the mighty Alpha King? A strange feeling stirred in her chest, a faint, unfamiliar warmth. It was like a single ember buried deep in ash, something she hadn't felt in years. It was a stark contrast to the devouring cold that emanated from him. She frowned, dismissing it. It was just the fire. It had to be. Night fell, and the storm intensified. The wind howled like a hungry wolf pack. Alara huddled in the small shelter, the fire a fragile beacon against an overwhelming darkness. King Kalen lay beside her, his breathing shallow, a faint white mist leaving his lips with every weak exhalation. Nyx lay at the entrance to their hollow, a formidable barrier of shadow and teeth, its ember eyes glowing in the gloom. She was trapped here, with her mother's greatest enemy and his phantom beast, in the heart of a blizzard. And for the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't entirely alone. The next days blurred into a desperate cycle of survival. The storm raged on, trapping them in their small, snowbound world. Alara became a creature of instinct and routine. She would venture out only when absolutely necessary, a fleeting ghost in the white maelstrom, to gather more wood or dig for edible roots she knew were buried beneath the snow. Each time she left, Nyx would watch her go, a low whine in its throat. And each time she returned, half frozen and exhausted, it would greet her with a soft nudge of its massive head, its strange, intelligent eyes filled with something that looked unnervingly like gratitude. It had started to follow her on her short forays, not crowding her, but keeping a parallel path through the trees, a silent, watchful guardian. The woods, once a place of fear, felt safer with the great beast nearby. Her meager supplies from the village were long gone. Now they survived on what she could scavenge. She boiled roots and bitter bark into a thin, unappetizing broth. She couldn't get the king to drink, but she would dip a strip of cloth in the warm liquid and moisten his cracked, blue-tinged lips. It felt like a useless gesture against the monumental cold that held him in its grip. The siege was not of swords and arrows, but of frost and failing time. Every gust of wind that threatened their fire, every moment his breathing seemed to falter, was an attack. She was the sole defender of this tiny, fragile kingdom of three, fighting a war against winter itself. He drifted in and out of consciousness, caught in a fever dream of ice. In his moments of delirium, he would speak. His voice was a broken rasp, words shattered by shivers. He spoke of a throne of ice, of a promise made to a ghost. He spoke of a family lost, not to war, but to a creeping, silent cold that had taken them one by one. The hollow cold, he whispered once, his eyes clouded with memory and pain. It takes the warmth, all of it. She found herself talking back to him, her voice low and steady, a counterpoint to the howling wind. She told him about the village, about the bittercress root, about the way the sun looked when it managed to break through the perpetual gloom of the fen. She told him stories she didn't know she remembered. Nonsense tales her own father had told her before he'd vanished into her mother's shadows. She was trying to anchor him, trying to give his mind something to hold onto besides the encroaching ice. One evening, as she was tending the fire, he shivered so violently his whole body convulsed. A low moan of pure agony escaped his lips. Without thinking, she moved closer, placing her hand on his forehead. The cold was still there, a vicious, biting thing. But this time, she didn't pull away. She forced herself to endure it, to hold her ground against it. And as she did, that strange, deep warmth in her own chest flickered and grew stronger, a tiny sun pushing against an endless night. She imagined that warmth flowing down her arm, into her hand, a meager gift of heat against his frozen skin. His shivering subsided. A faint sigh escaped him. Nyx, who had been watching from the entrance, rose and padded silently over. It settled down on her other side, laying its huge head in her lap. Its fur was thick and surprisingly soft, and it radiated a faint, living warmth of its own. Between the fire, the beast, and the strange heat inside her, she felt a fragile shield form around them. She sat there for hours, a human bridge between a dying king and his phantom wolf, her hand on his brow, the beast's head a heavy, comforting weight in her lap. She was no healer. She was nothing, the powerless daughter of a powerful matriarch. But in this small, snow-strangled hollow, she felt for the first time like she had a purpose. The king's moments of lucidity became more frequent, though they were fleeting. One afternoon, his eyes opened, and for a moment, the fog of delirium cleared. They were a startling gray, the color of a winter sky just before the snow begins to fall. They focused on her, truly seeing her for the first time. He took in her worn clothes, the smudges of soot on her face, the determined set of her jaw. His gaze was heavy, filled with a weary intelligence that made her feel transparent. "Why?" he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. The question hung in the air between them. Why was she helping him? Why hadn't she left him to die, or worse, run to her mother to claim the bounty that would surely be on his head? "Because no one deserves to die alone in the cold," she said simply. It was the truest thing she could offer. A flicker of something. Surprise, confusion, maybe something else, passed through his eyes. He tried to push himself up, a grimace of pain tightening his features. "Don't," she urged, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're not strong enough." His skin was still terribly cold, but it was no longer the soul-stealing frost of before. It was just the chill of a man who had been close to freezing. Her warmth, her strange inner fire, was doing something. It was working. He slumped back, his gaze sweeping over their crude shelter, the small fire, and then landing on Nyx, who was sleeping soundly with its head near her feet. The beast's presence seemed to reassure him. "You are from the fen," he stated, his voice gaining a fraction of its rumored strength. He recognized her features, the specific cast of her face that marked her as one of the Shadowfen people. The daughter of his sworn enemy. The accusation was unspoken but clear. He was a king, even weakened. He understood politics, betrayal. Why would one of his enemies save his life? Before she could find the words to answer, a sound cut through the muffled quiet of the snow-filled woods, the sharp crack of a breaking twig. Nyx was on its feet in an instant, a low, rumbling growl building in its chest. The fur on its back stood on end, transforming it into a creature of pure menace. Alara's blood ran cold. It wasn't an animal. It was people. She scrambled to the entrance of the shelter and peered out. Through the swirling snow she saw them. Dark figures moving through the trees, their cloaks the color of dried blood against the white. The sigil on their armor was a twisted, thorny vine. Her mother's guard. Panic seized her. They were found. All her efforts, all the risks she had taken, had been for nothing. At the head of the patrol was a figure whose presence dominated the landscape more than any storm. Matriarch Morwen. Her mother stood tall and severe, her face a mask of cruel satisfaction. Her eyes, dark and depthless as a bog, locked onto the shelter. They weren't searching. They knew exactly where to look. "Well, well." Morwen's voice was like the scrape of stone on stone, carrying effortlessly through the wind. "What have we found here? My errant daughter, playing nursemaid to a fallen king?" Morwen's smile was a terrifying thing, a slash of triumph in her pale, cold face. She had not found them by chance. Alara could feel it, a sickening certainty that settled in her stomach like a stone. This was a trap, and she had walked right into it. "Seize him," Morwen commanded, her voice ringing with authority. The guards advanced, their swords drawn. Nyx exploded into action. With a roar that shook the trees, the great beast launched itself from the shelter, a blur of black fury. It met the first two guards in a tangle of shadow and snapping teeth. Men screamed, their swords useless against the phantom creature. It moved like smoke, solidified into a nightmare of claws and fangs, and then dissipated again. But Kalen was too weak. He struggled to sit up, his hand outstretched as if to command the beast, but a spasm of pain racked his body and he collapsed back with a groan. The connection between them, the source of the beast's power, was frayed to a thread. Nyx was fighting on instinct and loyalty to her, not on the king's command. "You truly thought you found him by accident, little fool?" Morwen sneered, watching the chaos with cold amusement. "I have been hunting him for weeks. I knew the hollow cold in his bloodline was reaching its apex. I merely encouraged it. A simple ritual, a whispered word on the winter wind to amplify the curse that has plagued his family for generations." The truth of it struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. Her mother hadn't just found him. She had orchestrated his fall. She had used ancient, forbidden magic to bring the Winter King to his knees. As Nyx tore through another guard, Morwen made a sharp gesture. Two more guards, who had been holding back, moved with chilling speed. But they didn't go for Kalen. They darted towards the edge of the clearing, where a small figure was hiding behind a tree. Leah. It was Leah, the baker's daughter from the village, a girl of no more than 10 winters. She sometimes followed Alara into the woods, her wide, curious eyes missing nothing. She must have followed her today. The guards grabbed the terrified child, dragging her out into the open. One held a knife to her throat. "Call off your pet, daughter." Morwen's voice was dangerously soft. "Or the girl's blood will stain the snow. A pity. She has such pretty hair." The world stopped. The wind died. The only sounds were Leah's terrified whimpers and Nyx's furious snarls. The beast froze, its head turning, its ember eyes locking onto the child, then to Alara. It was waiting for her. Its loyalty, in this moment, was entirely hers. Alara was trapped in an impossible choice. On one side, a king she had risked everything to save. On the other, an innocent child caught in a cruel political game. Kalen, propped on one elbow, watched with helpless fury, his face a mask of anguish. He could not save them. She looked at her mother, at the absolute certainty in her eyes, the utter lack of any human feeling. Morwen would do it. She would kill the child without a second thought to achieve her goals. Ilara's own life had been a long, slow lesson in worthlessness. She was the dud, the failure, the daughter who brought shame. But Leah's life was a new song, not yet fully sung. Kalen's life was the shield for thousands of his people. Her own was expendable. The calculation was simple. It was brutal. It was the only way. She took a step forward, out of the shelter, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. The strange warmth in her chest, which had been a quiet flicker, now felt like a banked furnace, pulsing with a painful, desperate heat. "Let them go," she said, her voice shaking but clear. She looked directly at her mother, forcing herself to meet that cold, empty gaze. "Let the girl go, and the king. Take me instead." Morwen's eyebrows raised in amusement. "You? And what value do you have, little spark?" "I am your daughter," Ilara said, the words tasting like ash. "My shame is your shame. My life is yours to take. But theirs or not. Let them go. A life for a life. My life for theirs." She was offering herself. And in that moment, she meant it. She closed her eyes, picturing Leah's face, picturing the hope that had flickered in Kalen's gray eyes. If her death could buy their lives, then it was a death with meaning. It was more than her life had ever had. She accepted it. Willingly. The moment the acceptance settled in her soul, not as a thought, but as a profound, bone-deep truth, something broke inside her. The furnace in her chest erupted. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A wave of pure, brilliant light poured out of her, a silent explosion of warmth and energy. It was not fire that burned, but a light that revealed. It washed over the clearing in a golden tide, chasing the shadows from the trees, melting the unnatural frost from the branches in an instant. The guards cried out, shielding their eyes, not from brightness, but from a purity that felt like a physical blow to their dark-aligned souls. Leah, held in the guard's arms, was bathed in the light, and her terrified sobs quieted, replaced by a gasp of awe. The light washed over Kalen. He cried out, not in pain, but in shock, as the deathly cold that had encased his heart for weeks was violently thrown back. Color flooded his face, strength surged through his limbs. The hollow cold, the ancient curse on his bloodline, sizzled and recoiled from the touch of her soul light, as if from a sacred fire. When the light touched Nyx, the effect was even more dramatic. The beast's shadowy form solidified, its edges no longer smoky and indistinct. Its fur became a deeper, richer black, and its ember eyes blazed, no longer red but a brilliant molten gold. Power rolled off it in palpable waves. Morwen hissed, throwing up a hand as a shield of pure shadow. The light struck it, and the darkness recoiled, steaming like water on a hot stone. "What is this?" she shrieked, her composure finally shattering. "What are you?" Ilara didn't have an answer. She stood at the center of the storm of light, feeling a power she had never known, a wholeness that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Kalen was on his feet now, no longer a broken man, but a king. He looked at Ilara, his winter-gray eyes wide with a dawning, impossible understanding. "The Sun Soul," he whispered, the name a relic from a forgotten prophecy, a legend even older than his family's curse. A power that was said to be the antithesis of the hollow cold. He didn't hesitate. With a roar of his own, he and the newly empowered Nyx fell upon Morwen's guards. It was no longer a desperate defense. It was a rout. Kalen moved with the force of an avalanche, his strength returned, while Nyx, now a creature of both shadow and light, was an unstoppable phantom of retribution. The guard holding Leah dropped the girl and fled. Leah scrambled to her feet and ran, not away, but towards Ilara, hiding behind her legs as if she were the safest place in the world. Morwen saw her plan, her victory, turning to ash. Rage contorted her features into a hideous mask. With a speed that defied belief, she lunged, not for Kaelin, but for Ilara. She grabbed her daughter's arm, her fingers like iron talons. "If I cannot have the king, I will have his cure," she snarled. A vortex of shadow erupted around them. Ilara felt a sickening lurch, the world twisting and dissolving into blackness. Kaelin's shout of her name was the last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her whole. The villain had lost the battle, but she had won the prize. Ilara was gone. The dungeons of Shadowfen Keep were carved from the boggy, lightless earth beneath the castle. They smelled of damp stone, decay, and despair. Ilara sat on a cold stone bench in her cell, the memory of her power a phantom limb, a ghost of warmth in a world that was now nothing but cold. Her mother had not harmed her, not physically. The chains that bound her to the wall were cold iron, but the true prison was the oppressive, magic-dampening aura of the dungeon. The light she had unleashed, her sun soul, was now just a faint, besieged flicker in her chest, starved of hope. Morwen visited her daily. She didn't threaten or torture. She reasoned. She spoke of power, of their bloodline, of the destiny Ilara had thrown away by siding with their enemy. She tried to tempt her, to persuade her, to break her spirit with chillingly logical arguments. "That power is wasted on him," Morwen said, her voice a silken whisper through the bars of the cell. "It is fen magic, ancient and pure. It belongs to us. With it, we could heal our lands, drive out the rot. You could be a goddess, Ilara, but you would rather be a king's pet." Ilara said nothing. She saved her strength. She knew her mother's words were just another form of poison, but in the long, silent hours, doubt was a creeping vine. Was her mother right? What was this power? Why her, the worthless one? And where was he? Did he even survive? Did he care that she was gone? Sometimes, in the deepest black of the night, she would feel a presence. Not a person, but a familiar weight in the shadows of her cell. She would open her eyes and see nothing, but she could feel it. Nyx. The beast had followed her. It was here, a phantom in the stone, a silent, unseen guardian, waiting. The thought was the only thing that kept the despair at bay. Weeks bled into a month. The whispers of the guards were her only news. King Kaelin had not died. He had returned to Winterfang, his strength restored. His court was in an uproar. The enemy's daughter had bewitched him, they said. She had used dark magic to heal him, and in the process, had stolen his beast. She stole the Alpha King's beast. That was the cry in Winterfang. They demanded war. They demanded retribution for the theft of their king's power, his very soul. Ilara's heart ached at the words. They didn't understand. She hadn't stolen anything. Nyx had chosen. But the world would only see a thief, a witch from the Shadowfen who had ensnared their king. She knew Kaelin would have to make a choice. Appease his people, declare her an enemy, and march on the Fen to reclaim his stolen property. Or, what? Risk his throne for the daughter of his oldest enemy? There was no choice, really. He was a king. His kingdom came first. One night, the distant sound of a war horn split the silence. It was a deep, resonant call, the sound of winter's fury given voice, the horns of Winterfang. He had come. But was he here to save her, or to condemn her? The siege was brutal. The magic of Winterfang, clean and sharp as ice, clashed against the twisted, bog-fueled sorcery of the Fen. The castle shook with the force of it. From her cell, Ilara could only listen to the muffled screams, the clash of steel, the terrifying roar of power unleashed. Days passed. The sounds of battle grew closer. Then, one evening, the door to her cell exploded inward, blasted from its hinges by a wave of raw force. Kaelin stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the torchlight of the corridor. He was no longer the broken man from the snow. He wore the black and silver armor of the Winterfang kings, his face grim, his gray eyes burning with an intensity that stole her breath. He was every inch the storm god of the legends. He strode into the cell, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the chains, the pale exhaustion on her face. A muscle worked in his jaw. Without a word, he gripped the chains binding her to the wall. With a roar of effort, he tore them from their moorings, the stone shattering under the strain. She stumbled forward, her legs weak. He caught her, his hands gentle on her arms. For a moment they just stood there, the chaos of the battle fading into a distant roar. "I came for you," he said, his voice rough, as if the words were torn from him. It wasn't a proclamation, it was a confession. But their reunion was short-lived. Her mother appeared at the end of the corridor, flanked by her elite shadow weavers. Morwen's face was a mask of cold fury. "Touching," she spat. "The winter wolf comes for his little stray. You will not leave my castle alive, Kaelin." The battle that followed was a whirlwind of light and shadow. Kaelin fought like a demigod, his power a blizzard of ice and force. But here, in the heart of her own keep, Morwen was his equal. She wove shadows into solid weapons, her magic a clinging, venomous thing that sapped strength and hope. Ilara could only watch, helpless. Her own power was a caged bird, fluttering weakly against the bars of her exhaustion and the dungeon's oppressive magic. Kaelin drove Morwen back, step by step, up from the dungeons and into the great hall. The fighting was desperate. He was protecting her, keeping himself between her and the battle, and it was costing him. For every shadow weaver he struck down, another took their place. They reached the throne room. Morwen stood before her twisted throne of petrified wood, her power at its absolute zenith. She and Kaelin faced each other, panting, the air crackling with their raw energy. "You have lost, Winter King," Morwen said, a triumphant smile on her lips. "You cannot defeat me here, and you will die to protect the one thing that could have saved you." She gestured to Ilara. With a flick of her wrist, a dozen tendrils of shadow shot out. Not at Kaelin, but at Ilara. He moved instantly, putting himself in their path, taking the full force of the attack. He cried out, staggering back, the shadows clinging to him like leeches, draining his strength, reigniting the phantom chill of the hollow cold. Morwen laughed, a high, cruel sound. "You see? Your love makes you weak." She raised her hand for the final blow. Seeing him falter, seeing him sacrifice himself for her, broke the final dam within Ilara. This wasn't about kingdoms or prophecies anymore. This was about him. The man who had looked at her with kindness in his eyes. The king who had come back for her when the entire world had named her a thief. She would not let him die. She closed her eyes, ignoring the battle, ignoring her mother. She reached inward, past the fear and the exhaustion, to that small, stubborn spark of light. She didn't try to force it into a weapon. She simply called. She poured all her feeling, all her desperation and her burgeoning, terrifying love into a single, silent name. Nyx. The shadows behind Morwen's throne deepened. They writhed and coiled, coalescing. With a silent roar that was felt rather than heard, the great beast materialized from the darkness. It was no longer Kaelin's shadow, it was hers, a creature of her light given form in the darkness. Its golden eyes were fixed on Morwen with cold, absolute fury. Morwen spun around, her eyes wide with shock and fear. She had forgotten about the beast. She had assumed it was a weapon Kaelin controlled. That was her final mistake. Nyx lunged. As the beast's phantom form tore into her mother's shadows, disrupting her concentration, Kaelin surged forward, his strength returning as the dark magic faltered. He struck, not with magic, but with a king's justice, his blow disarming Morwen and sending her crashing to the floor. The battle was over. The remaining guards, seeing their matriarch fall, threw down their weapons. Silence descended upon the throne room, broken only by their ragged breathing. Kaelin stood over Morwen, his expression grim. But then he turned, his gaze finding Ilara across the ruined hall. He took a step toward her, then another, his movements slow, deliberate. He walked past his defeated enemy, past the surrendered guards, his eyes never leaving hers. He stopped just before her, his face streaked with dust and blood, his silver-gray eyes filled with an emotion so raw and powerful it made her tremble. He looked at her, then at Nyx, who had padded silently to her side and now stood as her guardian. "They said you stole my beast," he said, his voice hoarse. He shook his head slowly, a look of profound wonder on his face. They were wrong. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed her cheek. His touch was warm, solid, real. "It was never mine to lose," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It belongs to the light I have been searching for my entire life, without even knowing it." He looked into her eyes and she saw it all there, the loneliness, the pain of his past, and the fierce, defiant hope she had put there. "I love you, Alara," he said. The words weren't a king's declaration, they were a drowning man's prayer, offered up in the quiet after the storm. And in the safety of his gaze, she finally felt she had a right to be saved. Months later, the world was transformed. The Shadowfen, under a new council of elders who had long chafed under Morwen's tyrannical rule, was beginning to heal. The twisted thorns were being cleared, and for the first time in living memory, sunlight touched the forest floor. Morwen was a prisoner in the same dungeons she had once ruled, her shadow magic bound and broken. Alara stood on the great balcony of the Winterfang Citadel, the crisp, clean air a constant marvel. She was no longer the outcast, the powerless daughter. She was Ilara of the Sun Soul, Queen of Winterfang. The title still felt strange, a cloak that didn't quite fit, but the feeling of Kaelin's hand in hers felt like home. Her light, now a steady, confident sun within her, had not just saved him, it had cleansed his entire bloodline. The hollow cold, the curse that had haunted his family for 1,000 years, was gone, vanquished. The change in him was subtle but profound. The harsh lines of his face had softened. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, abiding peace. He smiled more, laughed even. The sound was still startling, like the cracking of a glacier, but it was real. His people had been wary at first. The story of the witch who had stolen their king's beast was a hard one to unlearn, but they had seen her light. They had seen her heal the sick, tend to the wounded from the battle. They had seen their king, whole and happy for the first time, and they had seen the beast. Nyx was a constant presence, a bridge between their two worlds, a creature born of Kaelin's soul but bound to Alara's light. It was a guardian of the entire castle now, a benevolent shadow that would often be found curled by the hearth in the great hall, allowing children to bury their hands in its smoky fur. Leah, the baker's daughter, now lived in the castle as Alara's ward and companion, and was Nyx's particular favorite. She was never afraid of it. She, like Alara, had only ever seen it as a protector. Kaelin came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. He followed her gaze out over the sprawling city and the snow-dusted mountains beyond. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "I was just thinking about the cold," she confessed, "how I spent my whole life fighting it, hating it." He was silent for a moment. Then he gently took her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her knuckles. His skin was warm against hers. His life was warm. "There is no cold here anymore," he said softly. "You brought the sun back to my kingdom, Alara. You brought it back to me." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. Nyx padded onto the balcony and settled at their feet with a contented sigh, its golden eyes watching the sky. The accusations of the world had faded into nothing. The truth was here, solid and warm in the circle of the king's arms, under the watchful gaze of the beast she had not stolen, but had simply called home.